June 4, 1942, Midway Atoll, the Pacific Ocean. The sun hangs low in the sky, casting long shadows over the turquoise expanse of the Pacific. Midway Atoll, a seemingly insignificant speck of land in the vast ocean, bristles with anticipation. The air is thick with the salt of the sea and the promise of impending conflict. At this moment, the island is quiet, its small American garrison unaware of the fury about to descend upon them. Thousands of miles to the west, the Japanese Imperial Navy has launched a bold offensive. Their goal, to secure Midway, a strategic outpost in the Pacific that would grant them dominance over the Central Ocean. A fleet of aircraft carriers, destroyers, and battleships move in tandem, their mission clear. But what they don't know is that America has prepared a surprise. Through intelligence, ingenuity, and a small dose of luck, the Americans have cracked the Japanese code. They know the plan, and they are ready to turn the tables. As the Japanese strike force approaches, the air is filled with the sound of propellers, a high-pitched whine that grows louder with every passing second. The moment of truth is near. The Japanese planes, confident in their superior strength, prepare to attack. They have no idea that the Americans are lying in wait, ready to surprise them with an unseen strength that will change the course of the war. The year 1942 had been a brutal one for the United States. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had sent shockwaves through the nation, propelling it into a global conflict. The attack not only decimated the American Pacific Fleet but also marked the beginning of a seemingly unstoppable Japanese offensive. Within months, Japan had conquered vast swathes of territory across the Pacific, including the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Their military was unmatched, and their ambition seemed boundless. By the spring of 1942, Japan's leadership, under Emperor Hirohito and guided by the strategic genius of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, had begun to set their sights on Midway Atoll. Midway, a small American outpost 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu, held immense strategic importance. If Japan could capture it, they would gain control of the Central Pacific, threatening Hawaii and the west coast of the United States itself. Midway would serve as a launching point for further attacks, ensuring Japan's dominance over the Pacific theater. America, reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, was far from prepared for another direct confrontation. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the Pacific Fleet, leaving many ships in need of repair and leaving the United States on the back foot. However, the attack had not destroyed all hope. The Navy's ability to rebuild was quick, and they began to train pilots and repair ships, determined to make a stand against the encroaching Japanese Empire. In the weeks leading up to the Battle of Midway, the United States faced a dire situation. The Pacific was in flames, and Japan was advancing rapidly. Yet, there was still a glimmer of hope, a secret weapon. Amidst the chaos, a group of cryptanalysts at the U.S. Navy Station Hypo in Hawaii had managed to crack Japan's naval codes. They had decoded a critical message that revealed Japan's plans to attack Midway. The intercepts provided the Americans with the intelligence they needed to lay a trap. This breakthrough would serve as the cornerstone of the upcoming battle, but the Americans were still outnumbered and underprepared. The Japanese fleet, comprising 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Saryu, and Hiryu, was far stronger, with experienced pilots and bombers at its disposal. The Americans, in contrast, had only 3 carriers, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet. Though they did have one advantage: they knew where the Japanese would strike. In early May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea marked the first significant confrontation between the two naval powers in the Pacific. This battle, fought entirely by aircraft, would set the stage for Midway. The United States, with its carriers Lexington and Yorktown, faced off against a Japanese fleet poised to strike at New Guinea and Port Moresby in Australia. The battle resulted in a strategic, albeit costly, victory for the United States. While both sides suffered heavy losses, the Japanese advance had been halted, and for the first time, the Japanese Imperial Navy had been checked. This victory, however, came at a heavy price. The Lexington was sunk, and the Yorktown, though damaged, remained operational. Despite the losses, the Americans had gained a crucial piece of intelligence: the Japanese had turned their attention to Midway. It was clear now that the Japanese were determined to extend their reach further into the Pacific. This intelligence came at a critical juncture. The Americans needed to act, but time was running out. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the Americans were fighting an invisible war. At Station Hypo, a team of codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Rockefort, had been working tirelessly to decode the Japanese Navy's encrypted messages. By May, they had successfully deciphered a key message revealing Japan's plan to attack Midway, though the exact timing was still uncertain. The Americans now had a chance, a chance to strike first, using the element of surprise to counter Japan's overwhelming strength. With this crucial information in hand, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, made the decision to act. He ordered a fleet to converge on Midway, using their knowledge of the Japanese attack to lay a trap. It was a daring gamble. Nimitz knew that his forces were outnumbered and that a loss at Midway could spell the end of American influence in the Pacific. But the potential rewards were too great to ignore. The American forces at Midway were now preparing for an attack they had known was coming. The base was fortified, and planes were fueled and ready for takeoff. Midway itself, a mere dot in the vast Pacific, was about to become the site of a battle that would change the course of the war. As the Japanese fleet, under the command of Admiral Yamamoto, steamed toward Midway, they were confident. They believed that their superior numbers and experience would lead them to a swift victory. What they didn't know was that they had walked straight into a trap. The Battle of Midway was not only a clash of ships and aircraft but also a battle fought by the men at the heart of it. The sailors, pilots, and soldiers who fought there were driven by a sense of duty, a desperate hope to push back against a seemingly invincible enemy. For the American pilots, many of whom were inexperienced and relatively new to combat, the Battle of Midway would be a trial by fire. They faced daunting odds, their enemy was seasoned, their numbers smaller, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Lieutenant Richard H. Best, a dive bomber pilot aboard the USS Enterprise, would later describe the sense of fear and uncertainty before the attack. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking at the bottom and wondering how long it would take to hit the ground. Despite their inexperience, these men were prepared to fight with everything they had, spurred on by the knowledge that the survival of the Pacific Fleet, and, perhaps, the future of the United States, depended on their success. On the Japanese side, the pilots too were driven by a sense of duty, but they carried the burden of overconfidence. After their stunning success at Pearl Harbor and the rapid expansion of the empire, they believed themselves to be invincible. This sense of invulnerability would be a fatal flaw. For the Japanese pilots, many of whom had fought in previous battles across the Pacific, the surprise and ferocity of the American counterattack would shake their confidence to its core. Their morale would plummet as they witnessed their once mighty fleet being torn apart by American forces. The sailors and soldiers of both sides shared a common enemy, yet they also shared something more human: fear, courage, and the will to survive. On that fateful morning, as planes filled the skies over Midway, the men below them knew this would be a battle unlike any other. The success of Midway can be attributed not only to intelligence and human resolve but also to tactical decisions that shaped the outcome. The Americans, for all their limited resources, understood the significance of aircraft carriers and the way modern naval warfare had evolved. At this stage of the war, the aircraft carrier had become the key instrument in naval combat, a floating airfield capable of striking deep into enemy territory. The battle would come down to how well the carriers could launch and recover their planes, how swiftly and accurately those planes could strike, and how effectively each side could coordinate their efforts. The Japanese, by contrast, had yet to fully grasp the importance of aircraft carriers in the same way the Americans had. They still relied heavily on battleships, whose large, powerful guns had proven decisive in earlier naval engagements. While the Japanese fleet boasted powerful ships, it lacked the depth and flexibility of the American carrier-based force. This miscalculation would become apparent during the battle, as the Japanese were unprepared for the speed and unpredictability of carrier warfare. The Americans, using their knowledge of the Japanese fleet's movements, were able to set a trap. Midway's location, along with the careful deployment of American forces, meant that the Japanese would be drawn into a fight they couldn't easily win. The American plan hinged on coordinated strikes and careful timing. It relied on intelligence, deception, and the ability to strike hard and fast when the moment was right. The result was a stunningly successful ambush. As the Japanese carriers launched their planes to attack Midway, American dive bombers struck with precision. The speed and ferocity of the American strikes would change the face of naval warfare and mark the beginning of the end for Japan's dominance in the Pacific. At the heart of the Battle of Midway was the use of emerging technologies that would redefine naval warfare. The primary weapon of the battle was the aircraft carrier, something that had only fully matured in the years leading up to World War II. It was the aircraft that would strike the decisive blows, with bombers and fighters forming the core of each side's offensive. For the Americans, their technological advantage lay not only in their aircraft carriers but also in the groundbreaking work of cryptographers and radar operators. The breaking of the Japanese naval codes by U.S. codebreakers at Station Hypo was perhaps the most significant technological breakthrough of the war. This gave the Americans an intelligence edge that allowed them to prepare and anticipate the movements of the Japanese fleet. As a result, the United States could position its forces in a way that forced the Japanese into a vulnerable position, despite being outnumbered. The importance of radar also cannot be overstated. Radar, still in its infancy during the war, allowed the Americans to detect incoming Japanese aircraft long before they reached their targets. It was a key factor in giving the American Navy an early warning of the impending attack. The use of radar during the battle enabled American forces to scramble their planes in time, launching defensive and offensive strikes in response to Japanese movements. In contrast, the Japanese had no comparable advantage. Though their aircraft and pilots were highly skilled, the Japanese had underestimated the role of radar and were heavily reliant on visual spotting and the experience of their officers. The Japanese also misjudged the importance of aircraft carriers as the focal point of naval warfare. Their underestimation of the American response, combined with a failure to grasp the full potential of new technologies, contributed to their vulnerability during the battle. In addition to the carriers and radar, the dive bombers used by the Americans, especially the SBD Dauntless, proved to be one of the most effective weapons of the battle. Their precision and ability to deliver devastating bombs from high altitudes gave the U.S. Navy a striking edge over the Japanese, who were using torpedo bombers and fighters in a less coordinated fashion. These advancements would set a new standard for naval combat and would leave the Japanese fleet reeling. The leadership displayed by both the American and Japanese commanders at Midway was a study in contrasts, and their decisions would have a lasting impact on the course of the war. On the American side, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's leadership was marked by calm, strategic thinking under pressure. Nimitz, though not physically present at Midway, orchestrated the battle from his command post in Hawaii. His decision to gamble on the intelligence gathered by codebreakers and the ability to surprise the Japanese fleet was a bold one. Nimitz was aware that the battle's outcome could significantly alter the trajectory of the war, and his willingness to trust his commanders and the intelligence community proved critical. One of the standout leaders of the battle was Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded the U.S. forces at Midway. Spruance's calm demeanor under fire allowed him to make critical decisions during the battle. When the moment arrived, he was able to launch a well-coordinated attack that took the Japanese by surprise. He took calculated risks, leveraging the element of surprise and the intelligence he had been given, despite the uncertainty of the exact timing and the unknowns that lay ahead. On the Japanese side, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, considered the architect of Japan's naval strategy, led the operation. Though a brilliant strategist, Yamamoto made a critical error in underestimating the Americans' ability to anticipate and counter his plans. His overconfidence in the strength of the Japanese fleet blinded him to the growing American technological edge. Additionally, Yamamoto's strategy relied heavily on a perfect execution of a complex plan that ultimately failed to account for the intelligence the U.S. Navy had gathered. The decision to send his carriers to attack Midway, while knowing the Americans had a strategic presence there, was a fatal mistake. Yamamoto's leadership during the battle would prove to be a significant turning point in his career. His failure at Midway weakened Japan's position in the Pacific and exposed the vulnerability of his once dominant fleet. His miscalculations would come to haunt him, but at the time, his reputation as a naval mastermind had been unchallenged. Midway, however, marked the beginning of the end for his strategy. The morning of June 4, 1942, dawned with the calm before the storm. The Japanese fleet was closing in on Midway, its planes preparing for their assault on the atoll. In a critical move, Yamamoto's forces had deployed their planes in waves, aiming to cripple the American defenses and pave the way for a swift takeover of Midway. But what the Japanese didn't realize was that they were walking into a trap, one set meticulously by the Americans, who were poised to strike back. The battle began with a series of aerial encounters as the first waves of Japanese bombers and fighters took off from their carriers. The Japanese pilots, confident in their superiority, flew towards Midway without realizing the Americans had already anticipated their movements. As the first bombers approached the island, American fighters scrambled into the sky, engaging them in a desperate but determined defense. It was a fierce exchange in the air, but the Americans were merely holding the line. They were buying time. On the ground at Midway, the Americans were ready. The island's defenses had been bolstered, but it was the aircraft carriers that would ultimately carry the day. In the early hours of the battle, the U.S. forces had not yet revealed their full hand. American bombers and dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet waited, hidden, knowing their moment was coming. By 10:30 a.m., the first significant event of the battle occurred. U.S. Navy bombers, primarily from the USS Enterprise, located the Japanese fleet. At this critical moment, American intelligence and the skill of their pilots proved decisive. Despite the odds, these American pilots, many of whom were still relatively inexperienced, pressed the attack. They targeted the Japanese aircraft carriers, the heart of Yamamoto's fleet. The Americans' first strikes were met with fierce resistance, but they struck with precision. It was a gamble, one that would pay off. As the Japanese fleet launched its own attacks on Midway, American dive bombers and torpedo bombers struck back with deadly force. At 10:40 a.m., the first bombers from the USS Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Richard H. Best, plunged toward the Japanese carriers. The skies exploded with the deafening roar of dive bombers plummeting toward their targets. The scene was chaotic. In mere moments, the Japanese were forced to react. But their confusion was palpable. As bombs hit their targets, the Japanese fleet was thrown into disarray. The Akagi, Kaga, Saryu, and Hiryu, all flagship carriers, were targeted in quick succession. The Japanese, unable to respond effectively to the American attack, were forced into a defensive posture. Their carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, were burning. At that moment, it was clear that the tide of the battle was turning. The Japanese pilots, who had initially been confident in their superiority, were now experiencing the shock of a lifetime. What they had expected to be a swift victory had turned into a deadly struggle, one where they found themselves on the receiving end of devastating, well-coordinated American strikes. The battle's tide had now irrevocably shifted, but the true magnitude of the blow would not fully be realized until later in the day. The critical moment arrived as American dive bombers, led by the legendary American pilot Lieutenant Richard Best, continued their assault. The skies over the Japanese fleet darkened with the approach of the U.S. bombers, their engines roaring as they hurtled down from the sky, their targets locked in on the heart of the Japanese offensive, the fleet's aircraft carriers. At 10:50 a.m., the first devastating blow hit the Akagi, the flagship of Admiral Yamamoto's fleet. A bomb, expertly dropped by a U.S. dive bomber, tore through the deck of the Akagi, igniting a massive fire that quickly spread throughout the ship. The Akagi, one of the pride of the Imperial Navy, was crippled in an instant. Within minutes, the Saryu, another of the Japanese carriers, was struck by another bomb and sent into a fiery death spiral. The Japanese were reeling. Their planes, which had been preparing for another assault on Midway, were either still on the decks or in the process of launching when the bombs fell. The destruction was swift, and within the span of an hour, 2 of Japan's 4 carriers were fatally damaged, their decks and hangars engulfed in flames. The Japanese fleet had lost its offensive capability in one fell swoop. By 11:30 a.m., the third Japanese carrier, the Kaga, was also sinking, its once formidable flight deck transformed into a ruin of twisted metal and fire. The loss of 3 carriers in a single wave was devastating for the Japanese. The Saryu, Kaga, and Akagi, each one a symbol of Japan's naval dominance, had been brought low by a handful of American bombers, their fate sealed by the precision of the attacks. The loss was irreplaceable, as these carriers were the backbone of the Japanese offensive. Without them, Japan's ability to project power across the Pacific would be severely hampered. As the destruction unfolded, the Japanese response was disorganized. The remaining carriers, the Hiryu and the damaged Yorktown, tried to regroup and launch counterattacks, but it was clear the battle was slipping from their grasp. The Hiryu, though not yet sunk, would soon meet its end after a series of American strikes. By early afternoon, the battle was effectively over. Japan had lost 4 of its most powerful carriers, and with them, its strategic initiative in the Pacific. The battle that had begun with such confidence and strength on the part of the Japanese ended in catastrophe. The Japanese had underestimated the resolve and ingenuity of their American counterparts, and the result was the shattering of their naval power in the Pacific. As the Japanese fleet limped away, battered and broken, the Americans stood victorious, having achieved the impossible. For the Americans, the cost had been heavy as well. The USS Yorktown, despite its heroic efforts, would eventually sink, and many brave pilots and sailors had lost their lives. But the strategic gain was undeniable. The Japanese, once seemingly invincible, had been defeated in one of the most decisive naval battles of the war. The balance of power in the Pacific had been irreversibly altered. The Battle of Midway, lasting only 4 days, marked a decisive moment in the Pacific War, shifting the strategic balance in favor of the United States. As the smoke cleared and the Japanese fleet limped away, the magnitude of the victory began to settle in. The destruction of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Saryu, and Hiryu, dealt a crippling blow to Japan's naval power. These carriers were not just military assets, they were symbols of Japanese might, their loss a devastating psychological blow to the Imperial Navy. The immediate consequences for Japan were catastrophic. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, whose leadership had been integral in planning the attack on Midway, would later admit that the battle's outcome had changed the course of the war. For the Japanese, the loss of their aircraft carriers meant that their ability to project power across the Pacific was severely limited. They had no immediate replacements for their sunk carriers, and their highly trained aircrews were gone. The battle also revealed cracks in the Japanese military structure, errors in judgment, overconfidence, and underestimating the technological and intelligence capabilities of the United States. For the United States, however, the aftermath was filled with hope. The victory at Midway lifted American morale and proved that Japan, despite its early successes, was not invincible. The loss of the Japanese carriers gave the U.S. Navy a significant advantage, and the destruction of Japan's best pilots and aircraft further weakened their ability to strike effectively. The victory not only secured the Pacific for the Allies but also gave the U.S. the opportunity to go on the offensive, shifting from defense to a strategic campaign that would eventually lead to the liberation of the Pacific Islands. While the American fleet had suffered losses, including the sinking of the USS Yorktown, the psychological impact was far less severe. The United States had proven it could go toe-to-toe with Japan and emerge victorious. This newfound confidence would fuel future campaigns and set the stage for further successes in the Pacific theater. The victory at Midway also had broader strategic implications. It shifted the initiative in the Pacific War firmly into the hands of the United States, who now had the momentum to press forward with a series of amphibious operations aimed at retaking the islands Japan had occupied. Midway, as a pivotal turning point, marked the beginning of the end for Japan's expansionist ambitions. In the weeks and months following the Battle of Midway, the consequences of Japan's defeat began to manifest in ways that would shape the entire Pacific campaign. The loss of the 4 aircraft carriers was not just a blow to Japan's immediate naval capabilities, it marked the beginning of a shift from Japanese expansion to a more defensive posture. Their remaining forces, though still formidable, were now stretched thin across the vast Pacific, unable to replace the strategic assets they had lost. For Admiral Yamamoto, the aftermath was particularly sobering. Although he remained in command, the defeat at Midway tarnished his reputation and undermined his position within the Japanese leadership. His belief in the superiority of the Imperial Navy's carriers had been shattered, and while Japan still had a capable fleet, its power was significantly diminished. Yamamoto, ever the strategist, would continue to lead Japan's naval efforts, but the loss at Midway had put an irreversible crack in the foundation of Japan's war strategy. By the time of his death in 1943, he had come to realize that Japan could no longer hope for victory in the Pacific. For the United States, Midway offered an opportunity to capitalize on their newfound advantage. The loss of the Japanese carriers severely disrupted their offensive momentum, leaving the U.S. Navy with the initiative. Over the next few months, the U.S. would press its advantage, beginning a series of island-hopping campaigns that would bring them closer to Japan's home islands. The Japanese were no longer able to launch the large-scale naval offensives they had previously depended on. Instead, they were forced to retreat, defending their remaining occupied islands and fortifying their positions. On the battlefield, the psychological impact of Midway was profound. It not only gave the Americans a much-needed morale boost but also instilled fear in Japan's leadership. The Japanese had always prided themselves on their military dominance in the Pacific, but Midway had shown them that they were vulnerable. The Americans, once reeling from the devastation of Pearl Harbor, had risen from the ashes to deliver a decisive blow. The symbolic victory at Midway proved that Japan's military strength could be matched, and ultimately surpassed, by the United States. In the broader context of World War II, Midway marked a crucial turning point. It shifted the balance of naval power in the Pacific, setting the stage for the eventual defeat of Japan. While the battle did not immediately end the war, it marked the beginning of the end. The United States, empowered by this victory, would go on to win a series of pivotal battles, including Guadalcanal and the Philippines, pushing the Japanese back and reducing their ability to wage war. The technological advancements demonstrated during the battle, specifically the effectiveness of aircraft carriers, dive bombers, and radar, would have far-reaching consequences for the future of naval warfare. By the time the war ended, aircraft carriers would be universally recognized as the centerpiece of naval power. The battle also demonstrated the power of intelligence and codebreaking, which would become crucial in the subsequent stages of the war, particularly in the European theater. The Battle of Midway was a defining moment not only in the Pacific War but in the history of modern warfare. It was a testament to the effectiveness of intelligence, the power of technology, and the unyielding resolve of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. The victory proved that even the most formidable enemy could be defeated when faced with preparation, innovation, and courage. The battle also demonstrated the transformative role of technology in warfare. The aircraft carrier, which had only emerged as the dominant force in naval warfare a few years prior, proved its worth in Midway. The American dive bombers, though few in number, dealt a crippling blow to Japan's naval strength. Radar, still in its early stages, allowed the U.S. Navy to track the enemy and react faster than ever before. The codebreakers at Station Hypo, working tirelessly in secrecy, provided the crucial intelligence that allowed the Americans to set the trap. These technological advancements would redefine naval combat for generations to come, making large battleships obsolete and ushering in the era of carrier-based warfare. But beyond the technical and strategic lessons, the battle holds a profound human significance. The bravery of the pilots and sailors, whether American or Japanese, stands out as a stark reminder of the high cost of war. Men like Lieutenant Richard H. Best and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, along with the countless soldiers and sailors whose names are often forgotten, became the faces of courage in the crucible of battle. Their ability to remain steadfast in the face of uncertainty and overwhelming pressure was a testament to the strength of the human will. The impact of Midway was not just tactical or military, it was psychological. For the United States, it was the first significant step towards victory in the Pacific, reversing the initial momentum gained by Japan after Pearl Harbor. The victory restored confidence in the American military and its leadership, proving that the tide could be turned. For Japan, it was a devastating loss that shattered their sense of invincibility and marked the beginning of their decline in the Pacific theater. In the grand sweep of history, the Battle of Midway stands as a pivotal moment in the larger narrative of World War II. It altered the course of the Pacific War, contributed to the eventual downfall of the Japanese Empire, and showcased the importance of strategy, technology, and human resilience in determining the outcome of global conflicts. And though the battle was fought in the skies above a remote island in the Pacific, its echoes are still felt in the lessons learned and the changes it brought to warfare, shaping the future of the seas for decades to come. The Battle of Midway was not just a military victory, it was a victory for innovation, courage, and the unyielding will to fight for survival. It remains one of the most crucial turning points in the history of warfare, a symbol of how a single, decisive battle can change the course of history.